Let's review and add a little depth to the classical school of economic thought, which was predominant before the Great Depression. The classical economists like Jean-Baptiste Say thought that economic forces, or the incentives that people face, will automatically guide them to a sustainable amount of production. It was Keynes, mostly in an effort to paint this idea as ridiculous, who characterized Say's law as supply creates its own demand. But what Jean-Baptiste Say really meant was that it doesn't make sense for people to overproduce or underproduce, and so doing so for an extended period of time shouldn't occur. In the language of Keynes, Say was claiming that a general glut in the economy could not occur. Think of a tree farm consisting of many thousands of trees. Ideally, if we want to manage this resource sustainably, we would cut down trees at a rate so that when we get to the end of our farm, the trees we cut down at the beginning have grown back. If we go too slowly, then we're leaving something on the table. We could have more wood and paper and other tree-based products without losing anything, because trees will just be sitting there, and wise entrepreneurs will move in and get things up to speed in order to capture the profits that can be made there. If we go too fast, we will end up with a lot of wood and paper and stuff for a short, glorious period of excess, and then we'll run out of trees, and we'll just have to sit there and wait in a desolate wasteland of nothing until they grow back. Not very smart. A wise entrepreneur will see this tree apocalypse coming, and they'll want to take ownership of some trees and save them for the time we run out and people get desperate. Of course, that'll just slow down our tree cutting. And by no fault of their own, those entrepreneurs seeking to capitalize on our despair will end up preventing it from ever happening. Incentives drive people to use resources responsibly. It is more profitable to use them responsibly. So why wouldn't they? And this production should produce enough income to support its own purchase. If it didn't, it wouldn't be the sustainable amount of production. Driving Say's law is the idea of self-correcting markets, especially the market for loanable funds and the labor market. The market for loanable funds, or the credit market, sets interest rates which equilibrate savings with lending. Thus, all savings should become investment. Hoarding cash is irrational. If you're planning to save your cash, why wouldn't you want to earn interest on it? The market coordinates time with interest and rewards those who save their cash. There's no value in having money sit there, and so all of those savings will be lent out for investment. This means that any income you don't go out and spend yourself will still be spent, because the person borrowing it will spend it, ensuring there is enough demand in the economy to go with supply. And in the labor market, wages should adjust to eliminate unemployment. Cyclical unemployment means there is a surplus of labor. More people want a job at the going wage than there are jobs available. The excess supply will push wages down, and those with alternative options will take them until all those who want to work will find a job. There might still be some frictional unemployment and structural unemployment, but those don't reflect an economy leaving the valuable resource of labor on the table. Then there is the quantity theory of money. It's an equation which is true by definition. M times V is equal to P times Y. M is the money supply. V is the velocity of money, or the number of times each dollar gets spent on average. So M times V is the total amount of money that gets spent in a year. If you know how many dollars there are, and you know how many times each dollar got spent, you know how much spending happened in total. That will be equal to the price level, or the average price of final goods and services, times output, or real GDP, representing the amount of final goods and services produced and purchased. If I know the average price of what was bought, and the amount of stuff that was bought, then I know the total amount of money spent on these things. Essentially, this equation says that the total amount spent on stuff has to be equal to the total amount paid for stuff. Yeah, of course. But it is also useful in thinking about how things might change. The money supply is determined by the monetary base, the amount of money in circulation, and by credit markets. Remember, banks essentially create money through the process of lending, and the reserve ratio sets that money multiplier. Fluctuations in the credit market, as seen in most financial crises, can create big fluctuations in the money supply. Output, on the other hand, is determined by resources and technology. It doesn't matter how big the numbers we print on our money are. How much we produce depends on the resources we have and the technology available to turn those resources into stuff. This is really the lesson of Say's law. So there is a disconnect between the money supply and output. Changes in the money supply shouldn't have an impact on output, a claim known as money neutrality. This means that any fluctuations that happen on the left side of this equation, in M or V, will result in changes only in the price level, P. In other words, changes in the money supply result in inflation or deflation, not in contractions or expansions in output. But the experience of the Great Depression flies in the face of these claims. How can one look at the evidence and claim that a general glut is not possible? How can one observe the mass unemployment of desperate job seekers willing to take any work that came their way and say that markets are self-correcting? Clearly, Y is changing. Such went the opening chapters of John Maynard Keynes' general theory of employment, interest, and money. No one had really bothered to assemble a consensus view on the economy which could explain the business cycle until Keynes did. And so Keynes himself is really the author of the classical school of thought. And he assembled it merely as a necessity in order to knock it down. Keynes rejected Say's law of markets, claiming instead that it was demand which created supply. He also argued that markets did not self-correct quickly, and monetary leakages, like people withdrawing their money from banks in fear and stuffing it under their mattress, would disconnect savings from investment. Further, prices and wages resisted pressure to go down. No one likes getting or giving a wage cut, and so firms will avoid doing so. With those frictions preventing a change in the price level, the impact of fluctuations will fall on output. Keynes argued that it just wasn't right to assume that human behavior would be consistent with these broad assumptions of rationality and impetus towards efficiency. He wrote, "Even apart from the instability due to speculation, there is the instability due to the characteristic of human nature that a large proportion of our positive activities depend on spontaneous optimism rather than mathematical expectations, whether moral or hedonistic or economic. Most, probably, of our decisions to do something positive, the full consequence of which will be drawn out over many days to come, can only be taken as the result of animal spirits, a spontaneous urge to action rather than inaction, and not as the outcome of a weighted average of quantitative benefits multiplied by quantitative probabilities." In other words, Keynes was saying that the invisible hand was not going to guide an economy to recovery.